All right, everyone, welcome in. Today, we're tackling something pretty massive. It's like a logic puzzle. But instead of numbers, we're dealing with, well, how do you feed over 1 billion people and do it sustainably? And not just hypothetically, but like actually figuring out how India is making that happen.
And the cool thing is, we're not just speculating here. We've got this chapter from a science textbook, and it gets into the nitty-gritty, especially focused on India.
Yeah. It's easy to talk about the feeding the world problem, right? But this actually breaks down the how. Like, did you know India needs over 250 million tons of grain each year? That's just to keep up.
Which is why, and I'm sure some listeners are thinking this, just clearing more land for farms, that's not a long-term solution.
Right? Like at some point you run out of space.
Exactly. Land isn't infinite, and India is already pushing the limits. So we need to get more out of what we've already got. But, and this is key, do it sustainably.
Okay, so less about making a bigger pie, more about becoming a ridiculously efficient baker with the oven space we've got.
Perfect analogy.
And this is where it gets even more interesting. India has actually been down this road before, right?
Exactly. Think about the Green Revolution. Massively increased grain yields. That was huge. Then the White Revolution, doing the same for milk production, also essential. But, and this is crucial for our deep dive today, those victories had a cost. They were resource intensive, and sometimes, well, let's just say the environment took a bit of a hit.
So it's like we leveled up once, but now it's hard mode to level up again.
Exactly. And that's where all these innovative techniques come in. The chapter breaks down improving crop yields into 3 main things. You need better plant varieties, better ways to actually grow them, and then better ways to protect them from, well, everything that wants to eat them before we do.
Okay, so it's like a 3-pronged approach to supercharging our farms. I like it. So let's start with, and I love the image this brings to mind, engineering the perfect plant. Like, are we talking scientists in lab coats, but instead of bubbling potions, they're surrounded by rice paddies?
Well, it's a mix of high-tech and surprisingly traditional methods. This chapter highlights how India is utilizing both, get this, hybridization and genetic modification to basically design crops for success.
So kind of like dog breeding, but for, keeping humanity fed. Give us the rundown on how that actually works.
That's actually a pretty good comparison. You know how we've bred dogs for specific traits, like forever?
Right, like pugs, for better or worse.
Exactly. So with crops, it's similar, just obviously a bit more high-tech than handing out dog biscuits.
Okay, so walk me through it. What's the difference between, and I'm going to be honest, this sounds like something out of Star Trek, hybridization versus this genetic modification?
Hybridization is actually the less futuristic one, believe it or not. It's basically what farmers have been doing for like millennia, just now we're getting all scientific about it.
Okay, so instead of just chucking pollen around.
Right, so say you've got one wheat variety that's awesome at resisting some awful fungal disease, right?
Yeah, those are the worst.
The worst. And then you've got another wheat variety known for its crazy high yield, but it's, susceptible to that fungus.
There's always a catch.
Always. So you crossbreed those two, and boom, you might get a hybrid that inherited both those great traits.
The best of both worlds, genetically speaking.
Exactly. Now, genetic modification, that's where things get really wild. Instead of waiting for generations of crossbreeding, you're directly inserting a specific gene into a plant's DNA. It's like a software upgrade.
So we're not just shuffling, we're like rewriting the code.
Exactly. And the chapter gives this great example, beet cotton. Scientists took a gene from a bacterium, inserted it into the cotton, and now those plants make their own insecticide.
No way, they're like little bug-fighting machines.
Pretty much. It cuts down on crop losses, but also means you need less pesticide overall, which is a win-win, right?
You win. But I know there's been a lot of debate about GMOs. What's this chapter's take?
It's actually very balanced, which I appreciate. Like, look, GMOs could change the game, higher yields, fewer chemicals, but, and it's a big but, there are concerns, right? Long-term effects, what-ifs. Those are valid. We need more research.
So not a magic bullet, more like a really powerful tool we got to use carefully, which I guess is kind of the theme with all this sustainable ag stuff, yeah.
Totally.
And tweaking the plants, that's just one piece of the puzzle. What about, like, actually growing these super crops?
Right. Even the best plant needs the right environment to thrive, which brings us to what the chapter calls crop production improvement. And the biggest part of that is nutrient management. Basically making sure the plants have what they need to, well, not just survive, but thrive.
So, like, instead of giving kids sugary snacks, we're talking about a balanced diet, but for plants. break it down for us. What do they even need, and how do farmers make sure they get it?
Just like us, they need a mix of things. There's macronutrients. Those are needed in bigger amounts.
It's like the plant equivalent of protein and carbs and all that.
Exactly. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, they're the big ones. Important for, like, everything. Leaf growth, strong roots, you name it. But then you've also got your micronutrients, needed in smaller amounts, but just as crucial. Things like iron, zinc, manganese. It's all about balance.
So finding that sweet spot, just the right amount of everything. How are Indian farmers managing all this? I'm guessing it's not as easy as, like, just buying a bag of Miracle-Gro.
You'd be surprised. It's actually way more interesting than that. The chapter goes into two main approaches. There's the classic, manure, and then there's fertilizers.
Okay, so manure, that's like the OG organic stuff, right?
Right. Decomposed organic matter, it's like a slow-release fertilizer. Improves soil structure and provides nutrients. Been a staple in India for, well, probably as long as they've had agriculture.
So it's that good old-fashioned, eco-friendly option. What about fertilizers? Those get kind of a bad rap sometimes, don't they?
They can be tricky. On the one hand, there's like a quick fix, right? Deliver nutrients fast, which is super useful in intensive farming. But, and it's a big but, too much is a bad thing. You get imbalances in the soil, pollution. It can even mess with beneficial organisms.
A delicate balancing act. So it's about finding that middle ground, using fertilizers strategically, but prioritizing the more sustainable methods whenever possible. Speaking of which, the chapter also mentioned organic farming, right? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, it's actually a growing trend in India, and for good reason. Organic farming is all about minimizing those synthetic inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. Instead, it's about things like crop rotation, composting, natural pest control.
It's like taking a more holistic approach to farming.
Exactly.
But even with the best soil, healthiest plants, you still need one more thing: water. Especially in a country as diverse as India with its monsoons and dry seasons and everything in between. So how are farmers making sure their crops are getting the H2O they need?
Well, you've got everything from ancient techniques to, like, cutting-edge stuff. Traditional methods like wells and canals are still used, but we're seeing more water-efficient methods, too, like drip irrigation, where water goes straight to the roots, minimizing waste.
Precision watering. I like it.
Right. And then there's rainwater harvesting.
Yeah.
This is gaining traction, especially in drier areas. Basically capturing rainwater during those monsoon seasons to use later reduces reliance on groundwater and makes the most of a precious resource.
Love that. But it's not just about how much water you have, it's also what you do with it, right? The chapter mentioned something about different cropping patterns. What's that all about?
Cropping patterns, those are all about strategy. Think about it, if you're planting the same crop in the same field year after year, the soil gets depleted, pests move in, it's not good.
So mixing things up is better.
Much better. And there are a few ways to do this. The chapter talks about mixed cropping, intercropping, and crop rotation.
Hit me with it.
Okay, so mixed cropping, it's exactly what it sounds like, growing two or more crops at the same time in the same field, but, and this is important, choosing crops that won't compete with each other, like maybe planting wheat alongside gram since they have different nutrient needs.
So if one crop doesn't do well, the other might still thrive. Built-in insurance, I like it. What about intercropping? How's that different?
Intercropping is like next-level mixed cropping. You're still planting different crops together, but it's about the arrangement. So you're maximizing space and resources. Imagine planting maize, which grows tall, alongside something like beans, which can climb.
A two-story farm.
Right. And then there's crop rotation. This is about long-term soil health. Basically, you rotate different crops in a plant sequence over several seasons. So maybe one season you plant a legume, which naturally adds nitrogen to the soil. Next season, you plant a crop that loves nitrogen, and boom, you need less fertilizer.
The soil gets a chance to, like, chill out and replenish itself. Love it.
So we've covered better plants, better growing methods, but there's still a big one, right? Protecting those hard-earned crops from everything that wants to eat them before we do.
Exactly. That brings us to the last part, crop protection management. Because, let's be real, there are a lot of things out there gunning for our food supply. Tiny insects, diseases. It's a battle out there.
And our weapon of choice is pesticides.
Well, they're definitely a tool, and they've been important for protecting yields. But, and I'm sensing a theme here, overuse can backfire. Pesticide resistance, harming beneficial insects. It's complicated.
Right, like messing with the circle of life or something. So what's the alternative? How do we fight back without, causing more problems.
Well, it's kind of like instead of always going on the offensive, you're trying to build up a good defense, like boosting your immune system instead of just popping antibiotics all the time.
Okay, so we're talking preventative measures. What are we reasoning with the insects now? Well, not literally. But one thing that helps is that crop rotation we talked about. Keeps the pests guessing.
Yeah, if their favorite food keeps disappearing.
Exactly. It disrupts their whole cycle. And then there's intercropping. Remember that one? Planting different crops together.
Yeah, like the two-story farm thing.
Right. That creates a more complex environment, which pests don't like. Plus, it attracts good insects, the ones that'll actually eat the bad bugs.
It's like building a more balanced ecosystem right there in the field. So cool. But what about when, stuff still goes wrong? Despite our best efforts, some pest or disease shows up. What then?
Well, instead of going straight for the chemical pesticides, there are these biocontrol methods, basically using nature to fight nature.
Okay, now this is getting interesting. It's like ecological warfare.
Right. So one example the chapter talks about is using a certain kind of fungus, trichoderma, I think it's called, to fight off soil-borne diseases. Instead of nuking everything with fungicide, you introduce this good fungus. It outcompetes the bad one.
So we're sending in the fungal troops. I love it.
No.
Okay, but all this talk about crops is making me hungry, and not for salad. Let's talk about the things that eat the crops.
You mean the animals that often end up on our plates?
Exactly. Animal husbandry. It's got to be just as important as how we grow plants, especially with more demand for meat, milk, eggs, all of that.
Absolutely. And it's not easy, right? It's got to be sustainable. It's got to be ethical. The chapter focuses on a few key areas within India specifically. First up, cattle farming. And cows in India, they're not just livestock,
Right, totally different cultural significance.
Totally. And that impacts everything from breeding to how the animals are treated.
Yep.
So there are two main types of cattle in India. You've got your Bos Indicus, those are your classic humped cows.
The ones you see in all the pictures.
Yep. And then you've got Bos Bubalis, which are buffaloes.
So different cows for different jobs. Give us the breakdown.
So Bos Indicus, they're known for being tough. Heat, diseases, parasites, they can handle it. Plus, their milk is higher in fat, which is good for traditional Indian dairy products.
So they're built for the environment, and they make delicious stuff. Makes sense. What about buffaloes?
They're the milk-producing champs. Way more milk than Bos Indicus. Lower in fat, but higher in protein.
So each one has its strengths. But what about, improving them? We talked about hybridization and genetic modification for plants. Does that apply here, too?
It does, but it gets, even trickier when you're dealing with animals, right? We got to consider their well-being, too. So the focus is shifting. It's not just about maxing out milk or meat production. It's about creating animals that are tougher, more resistant to disease, can handle hotter temperatures.
So they're better adapted to the world as it is, which I guess helps everyone in the long run.
Exactly. It's win-win. Healthier animals, more sustainable system. But cows aren't the only ones on the menu, right? What about chickens?
Right. Poultry is huge, isn't it?
It's one of the fastest-growing areas of agriculture in India. Chickens are quick and easy to raise compared to cows, and they're a great protein source. The chapter breaks it down into layers, which are for eggs, and broilers, which are for meat.
Makes sense. Specialization. What are some of the challenges with raising chickens, though?
Well, disease is a big one. Chickens are kind of fragile, and they're often kept in close quarters, so if something spreads...
It's a recipe for disaster.
Right. So hygiene is super important.
Okay.
And there's been a push towards locally sourced feed, too.
Which, again, the more self-sufficient the system is, the better. Okay, so we've done land animals. What about the stuff in the water? Fish got to be a big part of this, too.
Oh, absolutely. Fish are huge in the Indian diet. The chapter goes into both kinds of fisheries. Marine, that's catching fish in the ocean, and inland, which is rivers, lakes, all that.
So what are we up against when it comes to making that sustainable?
Overfishing is the big one. Demand is through the roof, so it's easy to catch more fish than can be replaced naturally. The chapter really emphasizes things like fishing quotas, protecting breeding areas. Got to be smart about it.
Right. Can't just take everything and expect it to bounce back. So how do we make sure there are enough fish to go around?
That's where aquaculture comes in.
Fish farming. Tell me more.
Basically, it's like agriculture, but underwater. You're cultivating fish and sometimes other seafood in controlled environments. Could be open, ocean cages, ponds, tanks. It's getting really big in India.
So we're taking some of the pressure off wild populations. What are the challenges there, though? I'm imagining it's not as easy as it sounds.
One big thing is the fish feed. A A lot of it uses fish meal, which, if it's not managed well, just contributes to more overfishing. So there's this push to find alternatives. Insect protein, plant-based stuff.
Right, because it's all connected, isn't it? Can't just shift the problem around.
Exactly. And speaking of connections, can't forget about our pollinator pals, bees.
So important. Without bees, we'd be in trouble. What's the deal with beekeeping in India?
It's actually a great example of a low-impact, high-reward kind of thing. Farmers get income from the honey and beeswax, but the bees are also out there pollinating crops, which helps everyone.
It all comes back to that interconnectedness. Okay, so we covered a ton today. Genetically modified crops, fish farms, even fungal warfare. What are your biggest takeaways from all this?
You know, one thing that really struck me is how resourceful Indian farmers are. They've been adapting and innovating for centuries, often with very limited resources. It's amazing.
It's like the old ways still have a lot to teach us.
Totally. And I think the other big takeaway is there's no single answer. Sustainable agriculture, it's about combining the best of, like, modern science and traditional knowledge. And it's a different way of thinking. You know, it's not just about squeezing every last ounce of food out of the land. It's about working with nature, not against it.
It's about the long game, making sure we can keep feeding everyone for generations to come.
Yeah.
Well, that just about wraps up our deep dive into sustainable food production in India. As always, thanks for coming along on this journey with us. Keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you next time.